so this is what I do professionally, right? I run a nonprofit. I consult for a variety of federal agencies, state agencies, et cetera. My education's in addiction. I got a degree in addictions counseling, but where I've gained my most insight from is being somebody in recovery, being somebody that has substance use disorder, being somebody that was a heroin user, being somebody that wasn't engaged with my kid for several years. And so, my goal, or my thought was when I got into recovery was that, if I could go get an education in addiction, I could go help some folks. And you fast forward a bunch of years, and it's often the life experience that ends up being the great teacher, right? Like what you're living on a daily basis gives folks more insight into our systems, our responses, everything else than any textbook or class or lecture could ever teach. And so one of the things one of the ways that I like to tell my story or to talk about it is in the context of that, of our addiction treatment system and how people find recovery and what my path looked like in that and where there were failures, where there were barriers. And one of the first ones is addiction, is substance use disorder really a chronic healthcare condition? And most people these days, because of the information that's been out there, would say yes. I posed that question. When I say, what do you guys think? Is this a chronic health condition? Majority of people now will say yes. There'll be a person or two that says, I don't know about that. There were choices made, et cetera. But the majority of people do. But our systems do not respond to it as a healthcare system for the most part. And what I mean by that is I started getting into trouble around my alcohol and drug use at a really young age. And the response to that was not that of a healthcare issue. It was very much of a punitive issue. And so when I started getting trouble at school, there wasn't questions of, hey, does he have a problem with alcohol or drugs? It was, no, there was a fifth of liquor in his car, and we're kicking him out of school. And the response to it always was, get him away from the other kids and punitive response versus, hey, what's going on there? Like, why is this 14-year-old drinking a fifth before he goes to school? Like, that's not normal behavior. And that was, unfortunately, for a lot of behavior change, a smack on the hand will change behavior for normal average people in general, right? Like that's why we have measures put in place in a variety of ways. A normal person, we don't want to say that you're normal, but just in general, if he goes watch football games and has 2 beers at BW3s, gets a DUI on the way home, he misses work the next day, his wife's upset with him. Being just a normal person that has some drinks, most likely, guess what he's not going to do again? Not going to drink and drive again, right? He doesn't want to put his job at risk. He doesn't want to put his marriage at risk. Like that's a situation to where you have some consequences for your action, and you say, "Whoa, I don't want to do that anymore, so I'm going to stop drinking and driving. Or I'm going to call an Uber. I'm going to do whatever it is." The problem with addiction and substance use disorder is the definition of is continuing to do something despite negative consequences. So that's kind of where it hinges at. He stops drinking and driving. I think, I make up a justification to myself, the cops are just trying to meet their quota. It didn't have anything to do with me drinking and driving. My wife doesn't know what she's talking about. I don't like that employer anyways. I hope he does fire me. You can find a way to justify. And I did that young. So I got kicked out of one school. Me and a friend were drinking in the radio station. Got kicked out. Definitely did not ask me if there was a problem. There was no assessment of Brandon. It was very much just looked at as a rules infraction. I had to go back to the school. There's a sheriff there. I had to sign paperwork that said I wouldn't come back on the premise for 5 years. So separating from education, separating from those things. I'm not advocating that there shouldn't be any action taken, but it seemed a little extreme to me. And so I go to a different high school. Normal person, right? You get the arrest and it's like, hey, I need to fix this. You would think somebody in my situation, you just get kicked out of a school, you have to go live with your grandparents. Me and my mom moved out with my grandparents to get me into that other school system. You would think that I would, start straightening up. But my addiction had already taken hold at that point. And so you mentioned the point, you're not thinking with that other mind. My cravings for alcohol and other drugs were at a point to where that was more prominent than the possible consequences. And so everything really sped up around that time. I ended up missing like 30 days of school in a semester, which is outrageous, right? Like that's just multiple days every single week, a bunch of it. And again, so I'm getting in trouble for missing school. My poor grandparents, God love grandparents. My grandma didn't want me to get in trouble. So she's like helping me like find like doctors, like she's calling the family doctor, like, can you please write a doctor's note? He's gonna get kicked out of the school if we don't come up with a doctor's note. So she's, she's an accomplice at this point, right? But she didn't know what to do. She doesn't know. And so eventually they're just like, hey, you gotta come to school or you gotta leave. Like you can't keep doing this. And I ended up moving and going or having to go to like an alternative type school. But even in that process, like I was staying up all night drinking, trying to go to school the next day. Like there was a bunch of signs that like something clearly is not amiss here. And again, no looking into it, no is there an issue, no hey, does he need treatment, like none of that. And again, it was just a punitive measure, and I was past the point of responding to simple consequences. Like my addiction at that point was well beyond me being responsive to some type of small consequence. I talk about the hot stove, right? Everybody's touched the hot stove before, and like you do it one time. Nobody ever does it again. But with addiction, it's like you go up and you keep touching the stove. Like even though you know it's gonna burn you, if I have this drink, if I do this drug, I'm not gonna see my kid, right? Or I'm gonna end up in a bad situation or whatever it is. And not being able to not touch the stove. And the powerlessness feeling associated with that for me, like a lot of times people think I was making specific choices to do stuff. And while there may have been a lot of free choices in the beginning of my process, once my addiction got going, like that was a foregone situation. Like it just was, I did not have the mental capabilities to like, just don't do drugs, just stop. And that was most people's recommendation, right? Like, why can't you just quit doing this? And so I ended up getting, kicked out of a couple schools. I went to the alternative school. I ended up having two friends of mine when I was 17. I remember specifically getting a call from my grandmother saying, hey, we need to talk. I was at a friend's house and I said, great, well, I'm gonna have dinner over here and then I'll come home and we can talk. And she's like, no, we need to talk about it now. I'm like, okay, what do you got? And she says, I'm on my way over. I'll be there in 15 minutes. And I knew that was bad because she would have just talked on the phone if not. And she got over there and she proceeded to tell me that they had just found my best friend murdered. Or at that point they didn't know, shot multiple times, and another really, really good friend of ours. And I wish I could give you some play-by-play on how it happened or my response. I just remember a bunch of yelling and crying, and it was just devastating. Like I just found out my best friend Evan had been murdered, or shot at that point. We didn't know he was murdered. And so I'm in a situation, like I had this situation happen, obviously hard to deal with. And then I find out a couple days later that they had actually been murdered over some cocaine that I had been a part of that transaction or bringing it into the fold of people. And what I mean by that was that I had given somebody some drugs. My friend Evan and Terry broke into their house while they were gone, took the drugs. They found out about it, and their response was to kill both of them. And so I know as a grown man that I didn't make 2 people kill 2 other people. That's well beyond my responsibility as a human being. But the 17-year-old Brandon did not know that and was very much caught up that if I had never introduced those drugs into the situation, this never ever would have happened. And it was hard to carry. Like it was really difficult, the idea that I advertently or inadvertently played a role in friends dying. It was also, though, the first time that I started to look at whether there was a problem or not. Because that's a big consequence. That's not getting kicked out of school. And to complicate it, the Evan and Terry who were shot and who died, the 2 folks that did it were part of our friend circle. They were part of our group. They weren't maybe completely on this inner circle, but we interacted on a regular basis with all of them. One of them's dad was a detective, and thank goodness he actually ended up coming forward and saying, hey, this is what happened. For his honesty, he got a break, and by break I mean he only has to do 55 years in prison. 18 years old, 55 years in prison, it's not a death sentence, but it's not far off for a family. The other one ended up getting 65 years. And so you talk about family disease, but you also just the impact and ripple effect that these situations have on groups of people. And so you got 2 kids that parents will never see them again, or families, and then you've got 2 other kids that their lives are changed forever as well. As a result of that, another person in our friend group several years later died by suicide. Couldn't deal with it. He could not deal with the fallout of that situation. And it's impacted all of us in some varying ways. It's the first time I ever tried to get a hold of my addiction. I started, unfortunately though, not having a bunch of knowledge. I saw cocaine as the problem. It wasn't the alcohol or the LSD or the other things I was doing. It was specifically cocaine, right? Because that's kind of what was involved in this situation. So I stopped messing with cocaine. And the result of that is I got 2 DUIs over the next couple of years, right? Because I started using alcohol instead of the cocaine I was using. And again, consequence. And it just was not impacting, the consequences were not affecting me as far as changing my behavior at all. During that time, right after my first DUI, I ended up having a daughter. Her name's Riley. Her mom watched me get arrested at 8 months pregnant on the front porch, me getting pulled over on the street in the neighborhood. I started drinking every night heavily after I got off work, but in the household with her, I was living with Christy was her name at the time. People say, well, why'd she put up with your stuff? It really wasn't like that. I was going to work, she was pregnant, I was stopping for some drinks when I got off work, etc. And she also knew that I was dealing with a friend that died less than a year and a half ago, 2 friends that died. So is that so outlandish that somebody's maybe drinking a little bit more than they would? She didn't think so. And I remember thinking specifically that once she had the kid, that everything would be okay. She'd get back to work, we'd find a routine. I wouldn't be drinking as much because of the stress involved in everything. And when you're 18, you don't realize that just because a baby comes doesn't mean everything goes back to normal. It's the opposite, right? In my head, I thought baby comes, everything's going to be okay. And boy, was I wrong. Financially, we were stressed, and women don't go back to work right away. It's not have the baby go back to work. We're talking several months still before that happens. My drinking picked up more eventually. Now Christy, though, instead of being at home and okay with me having some drinks afterwards, she's at home with the baby now, and she's put up. You gotta, you need to be here helping out. And this is, I hope, one of the ways that I'm able to explain the way my addiction talked to me and worked for me is that we had a very specific conversation. She said, I love you, but you're staying out all night drinking after work. If you love us, you come home, be part of our family. I love you, I want you to be here. And me telling her, I love you too. I love you, I love our daughter, I'll be here. Go to work the next day, worked at a restaurant. And what I'd do is I'd work double shifts. So I'd work 12 hours straight, and around noon or 1, somebody'd say, hey, are you working tonight? You gonna come out and have some drinks afterwards? And I would say, no, I'm gonna go home, spend time with the new baby. I need to be around there a little bit more, we're all good. somebody asking about 5 or 6 o'clock. Nope, I'm gonna go home and hang out with the kid and spend some time at home. We'd be closing down, somebody'd say, hey, you gonna go have a drink with us? And I'd say, I really shouldn't, because I need to go home to the kid, but we got done a little early. I'll stop by and have one. That's not the way it works for somebody with an alcohol or addiction issue. You have one, and that it's not the 10th one that gets you. They talk about this, the first one that gets you. It's that that kind of triggers everything. And so every intention all day long of going home and spending time, I meant that when I told her. When I said I'm coming home, I meant it. I was telling the truth 100%. When I told those people earlier in the day I was going home, I meant it 100%. It wasn't me like just plotting and planning that I was really gonna do it. I meant it. And then put in the actual situation of drinking and drugging or going home, like I chose drinking and drugging. And that would show up at other points in my life. You know, I ended up moving out of there with Christy and Riley and stayed with some friends, got another DUI, paid consequences, was on house arrest. One of the things I figured out is I started taking Xanax in lieu of drinking. Benzodiazepines are very, very similar to alcohol in their effect. You can take a couple pills, except for all of a sudden I'm not gonna get DUI, right? And so there was some thought behind that. Take pills versus drink, I won't get a DUI. And another example of not being able to not touch the stove, I was going for drug tests every Monday. I got drug tested every Monday. It was part of what I did. I had a breathalyzer, I was blowing at the house because of my house arrest, so I was doing that. So what I figured out was that if I went to my drug test on Monday, I could take pills like on Tuesday and Wednesday, and I'd be flushed out again by Monday. I remember going to, stopping by a restaurant. Actually, I wasn't on house arrest. I was just on probation. I didn't have the thing. I was just on probation, but weekly drug testing. And back then, you couldn't test for alcohol. And so what I would do is the rest of the week, I'd have some drinks. Because as long as you didn't show up smelling like a brewery, you were fine. Went into the bar on Saturday night just to have a few drinks. And a friend of mine was there. I walked up, we say, hey, he puts his hand out like this. Put my hand out. I look down. There's 2 blue pills in my hand that he drops into my hand. My very, very first thought, I have a drug test in less than 48 hours on Monday. If I take these, there is no way that I will pass that drug test. If I don't pass that drug test, I'm probably gonna go to jail. Very, very quick thought process. These ain't gonna be out of my system, I'm gonna go to jail. What did I do next? Took the pills. Like I couldn't not, like the consequence just wasn't registering as a deterrent to do so. And so there's been a couple moments throughout my life where I've really been faced with those types of things to where like using represented a very immediate consequence. Not like, hey, this is gonna happen later on in life, but like, hey, like you're gonna go to jail in 2 days. And I did. It's exactly what happened. I took the pills, I got my drug test, I failed the drug test, I went to jail for 15 days for a violation of probation. Things continued to spiral. I jumped between drugs, right? Like I stopped using the cocaine so I could do alcohol, and then alcohol got me 2 DUIs, so that was the problem, so I started doing pills. I've been in recovery since 2008, and I was part of that cohort of the original kind of Oxycontin to heroin to IV cohort of group, that group from about 2006 to about 2012 before they started redoing all the pills and stuff like that. I was part of that group. And so I was taking a bunch of Xanax so I wouldn't drink and get a DUI because the judge told me I was going to prison. That affected me enough to switch what I was doing a little bit. So I started taking Xanax, started taking Vicodin. Vicodin stopped working, started taking Oxycontin, and then ultimately ended up going on into heroin.
Can I ask you a quick question? You're mentioning all these medications. Did you get them from a physician or did you get them off the street?
Street mainly.
Okay.
Every once in a while. You can't get a big enough supply from a physician to uphold that type of habit. I mean, I was taking 10, 15, 20 a day, so I would have ran through a month's prescription in a matter of a couple days. But at that point, they were prescribing so many.
That's why I was asking.
Every grandma in town had a bottle of them, and
yeah.
Every grandma in town had a bottle of them in their medicine cabinet. That's not the case anymore, but it was.
It was.
Then,
that's why
sure.
I was wondering if the doctor had prescribed them or not.
And that's the case too. And that's important to know, just education-wise. People that actually just take prescription medication, specifically opioids, like as prescribed, Rarely is there an addiction related to that. It's almost always in conjunction with buying some off the street, taking extra, having fun. You know, it's like this, like, do we need doctors prescribing less? Sure, but like, do we need to do it at the cost of like cancer patients not getting pain pills? Absolutely not. Like we need to make sure there's good uses for those things still. And so there's a balance somewhere in between, but I was getting all my stuff illicitly for the most part. And that's how I got introduced to heroin, is I had somebody I was buying my pills from. That person went to jail, and I was searching around for other things, and I couldn't get hold of them. And so somebody kept saying, well, I've got some heroin if you want that. And I was like, you guys are drug addicts. No, like, who do you think I am? I'm not messing with that stuff. And eventually after a while, I did. I ended up being an IV drug user. I'm not going to stay in all the details, but it was a long couple years. And the way dependence works, it's just, it's tough. You guys all know, I'm guessing, you know, the withdrawal, if you stop taking opiates, you get sick. It's kind of like a flu. It used to be when I took those pills, if I stopped taking them, like I may feel like a little bit bad, but it would be a couple days later, and it wasn't very immediate. Once I started doing heroin, it happened almost immediately. So I would use at night, like 10 p.m. at night, I would use. By the time I woke up in the morning, full-blown withdrawal. Full-blown withdrawal. Like the worst flu you could ever imagine. So you start thinking about work, like you can't go to work. Like, I mean, just think about it. Think if you had the worst flu you ever had, it's coming out, like you're not going to work. And so that's where you start having issues with, okay, well, you can't maintain a job now, or I have to be late to work, right? Because I have to go pick some up on the way. Well, then all of a sudden I'm late to work every single week. And eventually the job falls through. Job falls through, you start getting desperate to come up with resources in order to fulfill that habit. You know, when I'm working, I can maintain something at least. I got some money coming in, I can, but it becomes hard to come up with $100 a day when you don't have a job, right? And so I was, and I followed the path of what many people do when they end up in that situation. You start resorting to either a couple things. One, dealing drugs, or two, stealing. And I, you know, did both of those things. And my poor family were the biggest victims of the whole thing. You know, I was taking everything that was not bolted down in my family's households, just trying to keep up with that habit. All of it was revolved around staving off withdrawal. The whole thing. Like everybody thought it was personal or this or that, or I was doing something because I was upset with somebody. The entire thing was me just trying to get resources to not be in withdrawal. That was it. Like there wasn't a bunch of magic behind it. But there was a bunch of collateral damage as a result, a bunch of collateral damage. So I ended up with a couple arrests. I was in and out of treatment a bunch of times. I think that I went to 7, 8, 9 different detox facilities. Just in and out a bunch of times. And I went once, the very first time. I stayed sober for 9 months. Unfortunately, I got this idea that, okay, well, if I do use again and if it gets bad, I just need to go to detox again. Because it worked. Like it worked the first time. Like I stopped using. 9 months is a long time. And so when I did go back and use, I had that thought. I'm like, okay, if this goes south, I know what to do. Go to the hospital for a week, I'll be good. It just wasn't that simple at all. And so, what I ended up doing was that things did get bad again. I went into detox again, but I didn't stay in recovery anything like 9 months. I was using almost immediately when I left. And it started this cycle of things crashing and burning, going into detox, getting out, and then using again in short order. And it ended up at a point to where I would go into detox or some type of treatment facility, and I would leave halfway through it. It'd be a 30-day treatment program, and 15 days into it, that craving to use would be so overwhelming that even in a treatment setting, it was so overpowering that I would just leave to use. And that is just the level of kind of, I don't want to say madness, that's not an appropriate term, but like the level of addiction and addiction craving in my head being that intense was really, my family was just baffled. They'd feel so good, like, oh my gosh, she's finally into treatment. They'd argue with me for months. I'd finally get into treatment, and then I'd leave a week later. My mom would just start sleeping well, knowing that I was in a safe spot. And so,
Can I ask you a question? Going back to when you started this at 14, can you, in your own mind, why do you think you started doing that?
So so do I remember when I started using, kind of what was the reasoning behind the beginning of use?
14.
Fun. So fit in socially. At that point, people were kind of starting to drink at like high school parties. I hung out with kids that were just a little bit older than me. And so I was hanging around with more 16 years old, high school kind of age. And those parties had alcohol there. And a lot of them had, I don't know if I'd call it entry, but less potent drugs, right? So you're going to have marijuana there, or possibly some other things like that, and then LSD gets introduced a little bit slower over time.
Did you come from a family that was acceptable to do that?
Not really. I had some immediate family that smoked pot. So that was, and it wasn't out in the open. It was kind of like knew that these two people did that. My family, middle class. It was just me and my mom, but I had grandparents, aunt, uncle, other family. They drank at most social family gatherings, but they had a couple beers around the pool and a glass of wine with dinner. Like I don't have childhood memories of like Uncle Jimmy getting trashed at the family. So it wasn't a partying type of atmosphere that I grew up in. I remember having fear around using the first couple times I used.
That's what I was going to ask you. It didn't scare you to?
So this is a unique perspective, and not everybody shares it. I was an 80s baby. So I was during Nancy Reagan and Just Say No and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. I was told if you tried cocaine just once, you could die. In that messaging. And so what happened when I tried drugs and nothing even remotely close to dying happened, I thought everything I had learned was a lie. I immediately said they were all full of crap, and it was a scare tactic, which looking back now, it was kind of a scare tactic. Unfortunately now, if you do drugs just once, you can die because of all the fentanyl and everything in it, but that wasn't really the case back then. And so that was my mindset. So yeah, it was a little scary maybe trying a drug once, but I was seeing other people do it and not really have any problems. And then I did, and I realized like, this wasn't a near-death experience. This wasn't close, and I immediately just cast away the other education I had had on it because I thought they were lying to me. And you're young at that point too. You know what I mean? You kind of know it all. So
you almost have this invincibility about you
Absolutely.
in your teens.
Absolutely. No question about it. And we know now, we got more science, right? We know that people's brains aren't fully formed till 25, and so like that need, we talk about the, consequence. That's another reason that it happens so quickly with kids is because they can't process consequence the same way that adults do. That getting kicked out of school, like what type of impact or an arrest on your record can have. Like kids just don't, it just doesn't register that
Do
way.
you have any alcoholism in your family? Like my husband's father was an alcoholic, and then one of our sons became an alcoholic, and he's...
So I don't know about my father's history. It wouldn't surprise me if it was there. We do know, obviously, professionally that genetics play a massive role, specifically in alcoholism. We don't have the same data on SUD. Most people think it's the same, but I don't know is the answer. It wouldn't be surprising. The genetic predisposition is a huge deal. My daughter, when she came of age and was entering high school, you better believe we had that conversation, right? Hey, this is the deal. You're going to probably try this. You're going to be around other people that do. But if you and 4 of your girlfriends are all lined up and one of you ends up being an alcoholic, it's a good chance it's going to be you because you're genetically predisposed to it. Now, if you never pick up a drink, that doesn't matter, but we just try to arm her with those facts that like, it's not going to happen the first time. It's not going to happen the second, but you have a disposition that your other friends most likely do not have. I believe in that strongly. I believe in the science around that really, really strongly. There's a lot of social factors like you were talking about earlier about family being around it. Was it acceptable? That plays a big role. It's that nature versus nurture thing. And both of them impact, but genetics play a big role in it. Yeah, we know people with alcohol, they don't process alcohol the same way, which creates a craving. And so there's a bunch of factors there. And so I was doing my in and out of treatments and the revolving door of them. And so one of the things I want to focus on is the difference in between. A lot of people think treatment is the goal. We just need to get people into treatment. And understandably so, treatment's very important, can be very, very important. But treatment's not the goal. Recovery is the goal. Treatment is usually what I would call the acute intervention to get you into recovery. Most treatment lasts for a week, 30 days, maybe 6 weeks if it's IOP type classes. If you were in a really, really great program, it could last a year, but that is very, very rare. It's usually 30, 60, 90 days. And again, we're talking about a chronic condition. It doesn't match up. If you're a cancer patient, how long are you going to be plugged into the system for? Years, maybe the rest of your life. 5, 10, the rest of you're at least going to have some check-ins to make sure everything's good. But with this, we put people in treatment for, and this happened to me, put people in treatment for 30 days, and they give you a graduation certificate. Like it's gone, like the problem no longer exists. And I understand, like we want to support people, right? You accomplish something, we want to make sure that we give them, accolades for doing so, but we're setting people up for failure if there's this idea that like we graduate out of an illness somehow. And so most of my treatments were that way. Very short, and they weren't effective. I was what you would call severe SUD case, physical dependence, a lot of negative consequences, not holding job, employment, all that stuff was shattered. And they were like, they're like throwing pennies at an armored car or something. Like, it's not even coming close to touching where I'm at. The level of care needed for me was far outweighing what they were putting at it. And that's why I was failing. That's why I was keep going in and out. I got really lucky. I ended up getting arrested again, and which I had done several times. Family left me in there for a couple weeks trying to figure out what to do. One of the things that we knew is that I needed more than just a week or a month. I needed something long-term. Between my long history of treatment, having the trauma from having my friends die when I was younger, like they knew like, hey, we gotta, like there's probably something there that we need to deal with. And they were right. And so we found a place that was 30 to 90 days. And I ended up, normal stay was 30 to 90 days. And they employed what we would call in our field a bunch of evidence-based practices. They did specific types of therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. They did therapy for trauma. We know that trauma plays a really, really big role in addiction. They used medication for my opioid use disorder, which did amazing things. And people, there ends up being the stigma associated with it, but in my previous treatments, remember I told you I was just leaving them? That's because my craving was so strong. I was in there, all I could think about was drugs. And I eventually left to go get drugs. I get in this place, they give me some medication, I'm no longer thinking about drugs every day. And so when the counselor's talking to me, I'm actually paying attention. When I'm doing educational groups to learn stuff, I'm actually can digest the information because my brain isn't going haywire just trying to find drugs underneath every rock, tree, patio, feet of fur. Like, it was so intense. And so when people think about like the use of medication, like that's what it's for. Like, it's so that you can actually focus on your recovery. And so they did that. They did the trauma stuff. They introduced me to other what we would call recovery supports. So your 12-step recoveries, your AAs, your NAs, because those are the things that really help people in the long term, right? We got the immediate treatment, and then historically, what we've done for both the jail system and treatment system is we'll have them for a little piece of time, and then we kick them to AA or NA. And I am a huge fan of 12-step recovery. It's part of my story, but it's not for everybody. It helps about half the people. And we need to have, instead of trying to say, well, you need to make it work for you, we need to provide other options, just like we do with other healthcare issues. You may have, this works for most people, but if it doesn't work for you, try A, B, and C. And so I started getting plugged in there. I ended up staying for over 11 months at that treatment place. I always like to make note that I had a family that was able to make that happen, some grandparents that were able to step up and pay some money to keep me there. Not everybody can do that. And I would say it's probably, people ask me what was different the 9th time, this time versus the other 8 times. And that long-term stay was a big, big piece of it, especially with how sick I was. And without having resources to do it, I don't know what happens. If I'm out again in 30 days like I had been all the other times, evidence tells me I would have went back to using. But it really allowed me that, I wasn't really getting cleared out mentally for, 90 days, somewhere around there, and started kind of pulling things together and got a job waiting tables back in an industry that I had used to work in. And, so you've got when we talk about recovery, goal being recovery, the programs that we oversee, they break that down into 4 main areas, because recovery is more than just the treatment, the healthcare piece. So the healthcare piece is one of it. Home, having stable housing is another part of it. I was living in this treatment place, and then they kind of turned into like a halfway house. You guys familiar with what halfway houses is? Recovery residences. They're houses where people go and they live with other people in recovery. And so that they're around other people doing the same thing. There's often counseling, things like that, so you can get support, so that people aren't going back into bad situations where maybe they do have parents or loved ones using. And this provides a safe, stable housing. And that's kind of what that treatment center was like for me the last 6 months. And then you've got purpose, which is schooling and job, and then community, which we talked a little bit about, the 12-step recovery, faith-based, et cetera. And so for me, you look at those 4 areas. The healthcare was happening. I was getting counseling. I was getting medication. I was in a treatment center. The home place was happening. That's where I was living at. Purpose, I got the job. I quickly moved up. And this is kind of how can we help in our community with employers and such? So I got that job. I had a bunch of experience in the area, so I quickly kind of moved through the ranks: server, bartender, trainer, supervisor, and I'd worked there for a couple years, and I was starting to go to school. I was making the schedules, I made the bank deposits, I opened the restaurant, I closed the restaurants, I had the keys to the building, all that stuff. But they wouldn't promote me to a manager because of my criminal history, my DUIs. They had a policy in place. Said you couldn't have any felonies. And I had a felony for my DUI. It wasn't from drug dealing, it wasn't from theft, right? Theft would be a big deal, right? You have money, I understand that. It wasn't from that, it was from DUIs. And so despite the fact that I was doing all the work of a manager, they wouldn't let me do that. Some people have said, oh, well, they were doing that specifically because they were paying you a much lower wage, it would have cost them more money. I don't think that was the case. But it was true. I was making $14 an hour versus managers like 22 or 25, which is a big, big difference. And it's important that we have champions in our life, because I had a champion there. One of the regional managers had a family member who was an alcoholic, and she just thought the whole thing was absurd. She's like, you do every function of a manager. You have keys to the building. If we were worried about you doing stuff, we wouldn't give you the keys to the building. You got the bank account numbers, you take the money, you do all this. And she ultimately advocated. She said, look, this is ridiculous. We got board members, we got executive leadership who have DUIs. The idea that this isn't somebody new we're hiring from the outside. We know him. He's worked here for 3 years. Are we really going to place more value on this old piece of paper than we are on what we know? They changed their policy. And so I was able to go into management. I think it worked out well for both of us. I ended up being a GM of a store. I ended up being a regional manager that oversaw multiple stores at one point. And none of that would have happened without an external ally, is what I'm saying. So we all have got places where we work, right? What's the policy there? Can somebody come get a job at the place if they have it? If they can show they're in recovery, that can maybe it is you can't unless you can show, hey, this is alcohol and drug related, and I've got treatment for it. I'm healthy now. I'm not the same person I used to be. And so I ran into barriers there. I started doing, right when I got my degree in counseling. By the way, it took me a year to get into school. A year, because of my criminal history. I understand the need to keep campuses safe. I do, I truly do. I don't have nothing violent on mine though. And there was a box they specifically, you got to check, said, have you been convicted of a drug-related offense? Not violence, not murder, not some type of abuse. Specifically, have you been convicted of a drug-related offense? I had to check yes. And that spurred a whole list of things. Boards I had to apply to, treatment records I had to get, et cetera. And it took me almost a year. Well, it was a year, but it's because I couldn't get it done in the first semester to go to the next one, so it took a calendar year before I got into school. So again, how do we look at those policies to prevent that? Because we're really if we want people to grow and become members of society, we gotta be reasonable with the markers we put in place. So I got my degree. First job I had was working in a county jail. Same situation, I really feel fortunate, but again, it highlights the need for advocates and allies. And so I'm trying to start working in the jail. You have to do a background check because it's a jail. We know my background's going to come up. The owner of the counseling company says, don't worry, the sheriff's understanding guy. He knows most people in recovery have some records, so it's not a big deal. Apparently mine was a little bit too extensive for him. So the sheriff's like, there's no way I can let him into my jail. Like, have you seen his record? Which it is pretty bad, it's long. Mostly minor in consumptions, DUIs, some drug possessions. And thank goodness, the owner of the company asked the sheriff, he said, look, that was a long time ago. At that point, I've been in recovery for 6 or 7 years. He said, at least sit down and have a meeting with him. And if you're not comfortable afterwards, then we'll part ways. And to the sheriff's credit, he did. He sat down, and some of the things we found out were that we were alumni of the same college. We went to the same college. He found out about some of the work that I did in the community. And he, by the end of that meeting, he was thrilled to have me in his jail working with the guys in there. And that's really grown. Like, we took that program that we had in that jail, the Attorney General, Curtis Hill at the time, recognized that as a best practice. We put that program into 8 other county jails around the state. And so me getting to work with the sheriff, who almost kicked me out of his jail, got to go around and help implement programs. And again, part of that's me and somebody in recovery, but the other part of that is an ally that's not having an addiction issue or substance use disorder. He relates, tobacco and chewless tobacco about him knowing like he had a cancer issue and not being able to stop. Same powerlessness, right? Like, I know there's a consequence, but I'm not able to stop. And so he could identify a little bit there. And, being willing to take risks when we work with people, right? They got to be educated, right? We're not going to lead with the chin, so to speak, but that had a huge impact on me. That work right there got me linked up with the Attorney General's office, where I was part of his opioid task force at a state level, which was also when I got into my current role. I went from that treatment center that I was a counselor for. I ended up being the CEO of that company, Proactive Resources. And then I got a person that is in my current position was retiring. And it was a position that dealt a lot with legislation, et cetera. Something I had interest in. I got to go testify for the first time ever at the State House. It was for a second chance legislation, so that if you have felonies, after so many years, they get expunged. And they approached me, they said, hey, this is part of your story. Like, will you come tell the story? So I went to the Senate Judiciary Committee. I'd never stepped foot in the State House before. I get there, I'm all starstruck, and the building's all big, and there's all these people behind, desks, and they got the little mics and the whole nine. And my goal always was to be a counselor. And it was to work with families and loved ones, like we were just talking about, to try to impact people. And I left that day, and it dawned on me that policy change could help tens of thousands of people. And I immediately was like in love a little bit. I was like, that's what I want to do. I want to do that. Not that I don't want to do the other stuff a little bit, but this is really what I want to do. So I did research. There's only about 2 people around the state that really, at that point, did what I currently do. Because it turns out there's not a bunch of people lobbying for the good guys. There's not a bunch of people, consumer lobbyists, so to speak, that go advocate on behalf. And when one of them retired, I jumped on the opportunity to apply for the job, ended up getting it, and I've been able to do a lot of really amazing work, both in the state and around the country. I helped with the governors Know the OFAX campaign, Know the Facts campaign. It's a big stigma reduction campaign, being part of the first round of people that did it, and then I've helped them find a bunch of people to do that campaign. I have worked with the Supreme Court of Indiana. Our state Supreme Court Chief Justice cares a lot about this topic. I've gotten to work with her on her National Judicial Opioid Task Force and as an advisor. I've done consultant work for the Department of Justice. I've done consultant work for SAMHSA. I've been to the White House to speak on addiction workforce, and done current work in another White House. So I've done work with 2 different administrations. I'm a heroin user in recovery, And so this idea that just because somebody has a substance use disorder that somehow they're not valuable or somehow that they can't be educated or that they can't contribute is something we got to bust up, I think. I think the idea that, yeah, we want you here to tell your story, but we don't want you involved in the decision making. Somebody having an addiction doesn't have anything to do with whether they're a good or a bad person. There's good and bad people that have diabetes, right? There's good and bad people that have a variety of healthcare issues, and unfortunately, and I think part of it's because of the arrests and drugs being illegal, that everybody that uses drugs is a criminal, and so we immediately write them off a bunch. And so I think it's important that we acknowledge and show when people do well. And so I was joking earlier at another speaking event, like, hey, don't read that bio. Because I don't like saying some of the stuff that I just said. It's kind of embarrassing for me. I think that it's weird talking about it. But I think it's important for people in recovery too to know, or people that are aspiring to know, that you can do whatever you want to do. The idea ever that I thought that I would end up at the White House, no, it wasn't even on my radar. Like, it wasn't even something I could imagine at the time. The idea that I would be involved in state level stuff where people would value my opinion, not even on my radar. And so one thing I push at the community level always, it's important to have people that are educated on topics at the table. It's important to have the institutions that are in that space at the table. It is vital that we have people with lived experience at the table. Not because they're the smartest people in the room, not because they know the most, but they are our consumers. Think about this. Every time you go somewhere, they beg you to give them feedback. CVS prints off a receipt this long, please give me feedback. Most places say, I'll give you a gift card if you call in, right? We don't do that in this space. We don't ask people, hey, what was your experience with the treatment system? Did it work? Did it not work? How was the customer service? We don't do that. We don't do that. Actually, in this area, we blame the consumer when it fails. They told me I was the reason every time that I didn't get sober. I wasn't trying hard enough. Well, fast forward 15 years, now that I've got more education, I look back at that and say, no, you guys applied the wrong treatment. Like, I needed what I got last first. If you guys would have done that from the get-go, we probably wouldn't have, we could have saved 6 or 7 years. And so it's important to have moms, grandparents, people that have had kids through the system, people themselves that have been through the system, to provide that insight. Because we can come up with a great idea and not know one small quirk that won't make it work. And so recovery is the goal. I got a friend of mine that jokes, he says, yeah, treatment's cool, but have you ever tried recovery? And that's it. Treatment's cool, but have you ever tried recovery? And recovery is easier when life is easier. I fully recognize my privilege of grandparents who could help pay for treatment. They bought me a car when it was time for me to start working. There's a lot of families that don't have that, right? And then, again, if you can't get to treatment, if you can't go to your meetings, they say it's your fault. We ain't no magic carpets around here. I used to do that as a treatment provider. I would say, well, if you cared enough, you would find a way to get to those treatments. Guess what? Single mom with 2 kids, like, you can't just magically make a babysitter appear. We just heard about that. Or transportation. And so we need to give people the proper support to make sure they can get to their treatment and stuff like that.
I worry about these teenagers getting involved in drugs and alcohol. Because like you said, their brain isn't totally developed. It must be very difficult to work with teenagers.
Way harder. So much.
And yeah.
So the question is about teenagers and their brains. Is it, the fear of if people start using earlier, the consequence, and there's a severe consequence to it because one, people that start using at an earlier age, that's a big trigger for if they end up developing a use disorder. Right. If somebody's 28 and they start, dabbling in this or that, they're less likely to form an addiction than a 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old. If they do with any consistency, the odds of that happening are pretty high, actually. Whereas a normal person, maybe not. And then treating them.
You still get that 14-year-old brain.
Absolutely. But what we try to do systems-wise and in the community, we need to have separate paths here because we try to take adult treatment, make like a small change, and then cram it down youth's throat. They don't respond the same way. They don't learn the same way. They learn in different ways.
So what do we need to do? Do we need to educate parents? It seems like parents are well, since it's all right with them, it's not like a red flag when their child starts drinking. See, I was brought up in a home that we don't drink. We just don't drink.
Right.
And so it wasn't, and like my husband, his father was an alcoholic, but it was such a bad situation that he didn't want any part of it.
Right.
So he's never drank either.
It can go two ways, though, right? So one of the question is what do we need to do? Do we need to educate parents?
But then our son did. I mean, he wanted to go have fun, and it's kind of like a personality type. Different personalities maybe get involved in.
I think it's education across the system. Yes, parents. Yes, others, and the need for honest dialogue. Because it used to that punitive approach. People aren't going to talk about stuff if they're going to get in trouble, and so you need to have relationships with schools, with parents, et cetera, that say, it's okay to talk about this. I'm not going to ground you for a year if you tell me you drank last weekend. Like, we just need to have more honest dialogue so that we can have a real conversation and then get people the help if they do need the help and set up a situation to where a kid can say, yes, I have a friend that uses, right? I'm a little worried for them. If they think they're going to get in a bunch of trouble, they just won't do it. And so there's certainly a lot of work to be done. I'm trying to get a breaking point so you can cut it pretty easy.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we're 5 till 3. So I thought we were 2:45 and then take questions for a few. Do we want to do any questions? Are we done? What do you want to do?
Anybody else has another question?
Does anybody have any? Just whether it's on this or off that. I think that some of the points have been really, really good that were brought up.
Sounds really familiar.
Yeah.
Two things that I struggle with the most, I think, is recovery capital for people, like you commented on, Brandon, because that allows you different choices.
There's a reason doctors recover at a super high rate. They've got financial resources, they've usually got family support, they've got a bunch of recovery capital, to your point. Sorry, go ahead.
And Beth is our peer recovery coach, and she really understands recovery capital. It's so important. Two is trying to get doctors to realize that the people we are servicing need to get in as quick as they can for evals and assessments and intakes that allow them to get medically assisted treatment. And that is a constant battle that I fight a lot, but we try to push it quicker for people that are fighting addiction because it's so important. to
Risk of
practice
death
people.
is so high too.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So the question was around recovery capital. And essentially what that means is recovery capital are the internal and external resources that an individual has to be able to find recovery. And so you start thinking about social capital. Do you have family? Do you have friends? Financial capital. Do you have access to financial resources, cultural, et cetera? And one of the points we're making is a lot of folks will look at some of the programs for nurses and doctors and say these programs are great because they produce such great recovery rates. It's not just about the program. The people that are in it are high-functioning people. I mean, anybody that's a nurse or a doctor has some capital in general. And so we need to find ways to support people with less recovery capital. So when they don't have the social support, how do we get them the social support? When they don't have the financial support, how do we get it? And that gets outside of the scope of like medical or behavioral health, right? It gets into housing, it gets into transportation. We need to be at a spot where we can write a prescription for transportation. Here's a prescription for a $100 gift card in Lyft cards or something like that. So.
Except there's no Lyft or Uber in this area.
Oh.
There is in South Bend, but not in our county.
We do have some vouchers
Can we do
that-
jobs? Can we create jobs? So one of the problems in a lot of rural communities is there are no rideshare places to help with transportation. There are no Lyft, there are no Ubers. I would challenge folks to how do we make that a pipeline for some jobs and get people doing it? Is there a need? Is it something people can do part-time? Because there's going to be some resources coming that way. So we need to figure it out if not.
One of the things that our grant does is we have vouchers through our older adult services agency that we use with our recoveries.
Good.
We have overdosed.
Round of applause.
Yay!
We'll wrap this up then.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brandon, very much for coming.
Yeah. Thank you all for the conversation. I appreciate it. Any folks that care about this are my people.